Spectre Vision Radio.
For early access to ad-free episodes, visit patreon.com/WNMTK podcast. I've always felt that my job is to listen, to document, to investigate, to be open-minded to where it might lead, but also to doubt, particularly to doubt. Because the unfortunate reality is that almost all the stories I receive don't stand up if you scrutinize them in a thorough, honest way. That's why I'm selective and probably haven't released as many episodes as people would like. I always thought wanting to believe set you up to accept things that simply aren't true. So when I started the podcast, my mindset wasn't one of wanting to believe. It was waiting to believe. Waiting for something to come along that would really test my rationality and reveal something that genuinely existed outside of what could be debunked. I spent a long time waiting. Don't get me wrong, I'd often feel that spine-tingling sense that something might be not of this world, or defy conventional understandings of it, but nothing ever quite stuck. Until the story I'm going to tell you now. This story, the one that ripped the fabric of the known world, tore it apart right in front of my eyes, actually begins with an episode from 5 years ago. You might remember it. It was the letter from the prisoner, Oliver Semyak, a high school chemistry teacher who claimed to have suffered from sleep paralysis throughout his life. Something which took a very dark, sinister turn and ended in horrifying circumstances. I'm going to play you my reading of his letter now, just in case you never heard that episode, or if it's been a long time since you have. Despite everything I've written here, I still consider myself a man of science. But I now realize the ultimate act of hubris is to suggest that because we don't know how something works, it therefore isn't real. But some things, I fear, we're just not meant to know. Some things we may not be allowed to know. Between the fabric of visible space and the intangible quality of sleep exists a being of whose motivations one can never be certain. To even begin to try to pin down anything relating to its shrouded existence is to feel one's mind butt against the barriers protecting inaccessible and forbidden knowledge. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Ever since I can remember, I've experienced the phenomenon widely known as sleep paralysis. As I'm falling asleep, just as I'm on the cusp of unconsciousness, my mind suddenly becomes fully awake. But my body is completely paralyzed. I become a prisoner, locked into my own biology, but with no agency over it. Simply put, my body is asleep, but my mind is awake. And as I lay there, unable to move, I feel the distinct presence that someone or something is in the room with me. It's as if it's constantly about to step into my peripheral vision, but never does. A visitor just out of frame who refuses to ever grace the picture. Aside from that feeling, that sensation that I'm not alone, the only thing alerting me to its presence is the sound it makes. In my vulnerable state, I'm utterly terrified of it. I can't move. I could be subjected to any abject horror this presence wishes to bestow upon me, and I'd be awake enough to suffer it, but unable to escape it. But the threat, and that is what it feels like, never materializes. Instead, I'm left feeling as if the presence is simply observing me, observing my fear of it, until I somehow am able to break its spell when, quite without warning or reason, I suddenly regain control of my body. I jolt upright and frantically search the room, but the presence is always gone, and everything is just as it was before I lay my head down to rest. My dealings with it have come intermittently throughout my entire life, some years being worse than others. I'd be lying if I said I hadn't noticed a direct correlation between my psychological well-being and its visitations, and I originally sought to attribute it to a stress-related disorder, possibly even some kind of psychosis. With time, though, I came to believe it was precisely my negativity and distress that attracted it. It wasn't a product of my unconscious mind. It was something which existed outside of me entirely that had found a way in. For a time, I avoided sleep at all costs, but that only made things worse. I started to see and feel glimpses of it in my waking life, a shadow flicker across my vision and then scurry back behind my eyes, a hand on my shoulder, only to turn around and see no one there. The only thing I was sure of was that I couldn't go on living that way. So, with no options left, I decided to try to communicate with it. It was a long process which started with trying to remain calm whenever I experienced an episode, which was no easy feat. It was trial and error, but I slowly got good enough at keeping my fear response under control that the threat felt, well, less of a threat. And, as I'd hoped, it triggered a change. One night as I lay there, unable to move, listening to the bizarre sound that always accompanied its visitations, I sensed the presence get closer. Pressure accumulated in my lungs, like something sitting on my chest. I somehow knew that it was letting me know that if it wanted to, if wanting is even something it feels, it could kill me. Of its dominion over me, I was left in no doubt. But still, I did my best to simply allow it to be there, rather than succumb to fear. After that, it got closer and closer each time it visited, until one night, it finally showed itself to me. It looked like a man draped in a veil made of shadows, blurry at the edges like a watercolor painting. But it wasn't just black. It was as if it was made of anti-light. Then, it happened. It lifted into the air like a cloud, floating up until it was hovering directly above me. With no warning, it morphed, taking the shape of what I can only think to call a long black snake made of smoke. I watched, helpless, as it poured itself into me through my open mouth. Still paralyzed, I felt nothing. I didn't have long to question it, because suddenly, my body began to move. By climbing inside me, it had turned me into some kind of perverse meat puppet. I could still see through my eyes, but I had no autonomy over what my body was doing, and no access to whatever it was the presence had planned for me. And what it chose to do with my corporeal form surprised me. It simply walked me out of my house and down the street. At a point which didn't appear to be of any significance, it made my body turn around and head back home.
back up the stairs, and climb back into bed. As soon as my head hit the pillow, I bolted upright, now completely in control of my body again. And the presence was gone. But that was just the first time. Each subsequent visit, whenever I was laying paralyzed, it would do the same again. Float into me. And each time it did, it took me progressively further. Until the night we got to a house. There was nothing remarkable about it, the same as all the others on the street. But it made me stand there practically all night, just staring up at it. Night after night, it'd make me take the same route, stare at that house for hours, then simply head back. And each time, I'd suddenly bolt upright in my bed, back in control. Were these lucid dreams? Was it actually happening? The house it kept taking me to was real, that much I knew. I took the route myself during daylight hours, and found it exactly the same as it was during my nighttime visitations. I could still see nothing remarkable about it. No reason for it to be taking me there over and over again. There seemed to be nothing of note about the man who lived inside it either. His life seemed what you might call typical or normal. Things went on like that for quite a while. But then, something happened. One night, when I guess the presence had got accustomed enough to using my body, the next part of its plan for me kicked into gear. It took me along the usual route to the house. Only this time it had me break in through the back door. I watched as my hands searched the kitchen for a weapon, settled on a carving knife, and brutalized the man who lived there. This time, when I bolted upright back in my bed, I was covered in blood. What had transpired was very real. And though I had no control over what had happened, my body had committed the atrocity. Panic set in. I scrubbed every inch of my skin until it was raw. I burned the clothes I'd been wearing, along with my bedsheets, setting it all ablaze in my backyard. But I waited a couple days, and my certainty began to waver. The need to know if what had happened got the better of me. So I drove by the house. Sure enough, I saw it had been cordoned off with police tape, and officers were still posted outside. Then it hit the papers. Reports claiming witnesses said they'd seen a man just standing in the street, staring up at the place in the months before the murder, night after night. When the police eventually came for me, I did not go quietly. I fought them out of instinct. Maybe I knew, deep inside, that there was no way they'd see reason and hear me out on what had really happened. The day they ambushed me at my home, I kicked and screamed, even attacked one of them. That all counted against me, of course. It wasn't long before I was told that video camera evidence showed me making the journey from my house to the victims over and over again. It even showed me walking back home the night of the murder, covered in blood, staring blankly ahead, movements almost mechanical. The trial is a blur to me even now. In truth, it was only once I'd been in prison for a few months with a lifetime of incarceration ahead of me that reality well and truly set in. That's why it took me so long to express everything this way. The presence no longer visits me. Sometimes I wake up in the dead of night, and I think I can hear that clicking sound again. But then I realize I'm able to move my body, and the sound is just the tap in my cell dripping. Whatever its purpose for wanting that man dead, and for wanting me to be the one to kill him, I guess I'll never know. I'm writing to you because I don't know where else to turn. Because everyone who knew me has disowned me. Because the system doesn't understand my version of events. Because I've exhausted all my appeals. Because, worst of all, no one believes me. But you believe me, don't you?
Oliver's case intrigued me from the start. His claims of an unseen presence accompanied by a distinctive clicking sound, one that then revealed itself to be some kind of entity, one that appeared to be made of shadows or black smoke, that took control of him and ultimately led him to murder a complete stranger. The authorities, naturally, disagreed with his explanation. The physical evidence showed he committed the crime. He was found guilty at trial, and he was sentenced to life. Most of you agreed with my ultimate assessment of the case, that although there were intriguing elements, the likelihood it was a tragic account of mental illness, or a disturbing attempt to excuse an act of violence, or perhaps even mount an insanity defense, couldn't be ignored. I did receive quite a few emails after the episode went out. A few accused me of giving airtime to a killer, but not many. Most of the emails were from others who claimed to have experienced similar episodes of sleep paralysis. You might have even seen some in the comments. People sharing their experiences, but ones that never ended as dramatically or as badly as Oliver Semiak's story. To be honest, I forgot about it. On to the next story. But then, not too long ago, I received an email from a woman we'll call Claire, and for reasons I couldn't quite get a handle on, it unsettled me. Maybe it was because, unlike most messages I get about experiences, Claire wasn't writing about something that had happened years ago. She wasn't describing a half-forgotten nightmare. It was something happening now, and still happening. The message was short, and I'll read it to you in full, but I've removed identifying information for obvious reasons. It read as follows. My sister recently discovered your podcast, and she called me and told me to listen to the episode about Oliver Semiak. My partner Brad experiences sleep paralysis, and has done ever since he was a teenager. I've known about it ever since we first got together. But then I started waking up at night and finding he wasn't in the bed next to me. He wasn't anywhere in the house. He was gone. I waited up, worried sick, and a few hours later he came back. It was like he was sleepwalking with his eyes open, like he couldn't hear me at all when I asked him again and again where he'd been. He just got back into bed, closed his eyes, and slept until morning. Once he was awake, he claimed he didn't remember any of it. One night, I woke up to find him missing again. I went looking for him and found him standing outside a house in our neighborhood, just staring up at it. He didn't remember it the next day, but it happened again and again. 4 times now I found him, staring up at that same house, like he's sleepwalking with his eyes open. At first, I wasn't concerned when I listened to your episode about Oliver Semiak and heard him describing sleep paralysis. Lots of people have sleep paralysis. I wasn't concerned when he described feeling like somebody was in the room. Lots of people say that too. I wasn't even truly scared when he described visiting the same house again and again while in that state. What scared me was when he described the clicking, because my partner Brad has never told anyone about the clicking, except me. Claire's email struck a chord with me as soon as I read it. There was a sincerity to it, a lack of embellishment. As you can imagine, as well as interesting stuff from honest people, I also get a lot of nonsense sent to me. People wanting attention, some doing it as a prank. But most people attempting to convince you of something extraordinary tend to over-explain. They provide unnecessary details. Claire didn't. I responded later that evening. We emailed back and forth, and I explained that the investigations I did for the podcast were free of charge, and that she could remain totally anonymous if she wanted to. After a few days, we arranged a phone call. From her voice, Claire seemed utterly exhausted, but she seemed with it, completely rational and sane, albeit confused by the strange events she claimed were happening to her partner Brad. After exchanging pleasantries and her confessing she was only talking to me because she needed someone to tell, I asked her to lay everything out for me from the beginning. There was a long pause. Then she said something that immediately caught my attention. "I don't think he's dangerous." It was as if that was the thing she'd been considering most, and I realized just how much Oliver Semyak's letter had got under her skin. But I knew it would derail things if I responded to that statement, one she needed to convince herself of, so I nodded and kept quiet, inviting her to continue. She explained that considering Brad had suffered episodes of sleep paralysis since his teenage years, he'd learned to live with it, and not to panic when it happened. The episodes came and went. Sometimes he'd go years without one, but when it did come, he knew what it was, and said it didn't really affect him that much. But then, things changed. The clicking began. She described waking in the middle of the night to find Brad staring up at the ceiling, completely motionless, eyes open. She recognized it immediately as an episode, and shook him a few times until he snapped out of it. She asked him if he was okay, and he said yeah, but I could hear this weird clicking sound. The episodes became more frequent, getting to the point where he'd have them a few times a week. Brad kept complaining about that strange clicking. He asked her if she'd heard it, but she hadn't. She even investigated if something in the room might be causing the sound, but turned up nothing. She started noticing that Brad was becoming withdrawn, distracted. Then came the sleepwalking she described in her first email to me. Finding him out in the street, standing motionless, staring up at that same house each time, always with no memory of it after. I asked her if she knew who lived in that house. "I don't know them personally," she said, "but I looked into it. They're just an average family. Brad doesn't know them either." Claire said nothing made her believe the family, or anyone on the street, had noticed Brad on his nighttime visits. No one had come over to complain. No one had called the cops. "But I did record him on my phone the last time," she said. "I think I just wanted to almost double-check it was really happening, you know?" She sent me the video, a short clip of him standing there in the middle of the street, not reacting to her voice as she repeatedly called his name in a whispered hiss. Just as she described, his eyes were open, his stare blank. If you didn't know the rest of it, you'd think him standing there staring was completely a decision of his own making, of his waking mind. Sensing there might be a great episode in it, I decided to offer to drive out to see them in person. It was about a 6-hour journey, but I told her it was no problem. And that single decision turned out to be my fatal mistake. A few days later, I made the drive out. Claire greeted me at the door, looking worn out and wired, and told me she'd convinced Brad to talk to me. She'd even convinced him to listen to my reading of Oliver's letter. She led me into the kitchen, where Brad was sitting at the table. He smiled when he got up to shake my hand, but he mostly just seemed embarrassed. We made idle chit-chat, but quickly got on to the reason why I was there. Brad recounted everything basically the way Claire had already laid out for me. It seemed the whole thing bothered him more because he hated causing Claire distress than because he was genuinely worried that his strange nighttime affliction meant something truly scary was on the horizon. The conversation about him sleepwalking over to that house repeatedly yielded nothing beyond yet more claims he remembered none of it. But when I asked about the episodes of sleep paralysis he did remember, and about the clicking specifically, something changed, only slightly, a tightening around his eyes, the first visible sign of worry in what had otherwise been a dismissive account on his part. "Can you describe it?" I asked. "You know when something catches in your throat, and it kinda clicks?" he said. "So it sounds like it's coming from a person," I replied, He hesitated. Not exactly, he said. I asked whether he'd ever seen anything during those episodes. A presence, something like the shadow figure Oliver Semyak had described, or the black smoke he claimed it had become. No, Brad said, fidgeting in his seat, but... I waited for him to add the words to the space he'd left hanging. I felt like something was just outside of my vision, he said. I asked him to elaborate, to try to qualify why he felt that way. You know when you just sense there's someone standing behind you, and you turn around and you were right? He asked. It's kind of like that. Only because I can't move, I can't turn my head to see it. Once I'd finished up speaking to them, Claire gave me the address of the house Brad kept standing outside. Even though it was a short walk away, I decided to drive over to avoid being another person staring up at it and potentially causing alarm, having promised Claire I'd be discreet and careful. If I go over there and tell them they have to leave because my partner might kill them, they'll just think I'm crazy and call the police, she'd said, and I'm not even sure I believe that. I don't believe that, Brad had said, interjecting. Is something strange going on? Yes. Do parts of it resemble what that guy in prison said? Sure. But I'm not capable of hurting anyone. Besides, he'd added, do I need to remind us all that the events that murderer described are what he claims happened? Have you both forgotten the distinct possibility he's lying? Or crazy, and it didn't happen that way at all? I'd assured him that was very much present in my mind, and told him I'd call them from my hotel later, after checking out the house. It was a house like all the others on the street, unremarkable in its suburban normality, the kind of place you drive past a million times and literally never think about again. And it really did seem like the family who resided within it were as typical as they come. The place was littered with evidence of ordinary life. A bicycle rested against the side wall, a couple of kids' toys on the lawn that had escaped the last tidy-up, what looked like a new grill that had been left on the porch and hadn't yet been installed in its rightful place. There was nothing obviously significant about any of it. I was about to drive away when a tapping sound on the passenger side window caused me to take my hand off the keys and turn my head. A guy was standing there, leaning over and looking at me through the glass. I lowered the window and asked what I could do for him. Are you one of us? He asked, peering at me curiously. I kept silent and took him in. Whatever they were, the us he was asking if I was a part of, I could tell by the grin threatening to break across his lips that he was hoping the answer was yes. As he waited for me to respond, he lifted his right hand to rest it on the edge of the open window, brandishing a tattoo just above his knuckles as he did. One of what? I asked, eyeing the tattoo, which was a simple circle made with wavy lines. The flicker of a grin on his face evaporated instantly, and his features dropped into a stoic, almost beige expression. Nothing, he said, withdrawing his hand, straightening up and readying himself to leave. I'm sorry I bothered you. With that, he walked briskly away, got into a car further down the street, and drove off, turning out of sight. It was a strange encounter, for sure, and the way he'd set his hand on the window had a deliberateness to it, almost like the tattoo was a flag he was raising, to see if I'd recognize it and react somehow. I grabbed my notepad from my bag and quickly made a crude sketch of the tattoo from memory, wanting to commit it to paper before my mind started to disintegrate or warp it. But it was just a wavy circle that in that moment meant nothing. That evening, I decided to enlist the help of the community. I had an episode I was about to release that same night, and recorded a little addendum, which I inserted at the end, asking for listeners to participate in my next investigation. I didn't say anything about Claire and Brad and their situation. I just said I was working on a follow-up to Oliver Semyak's story, and that I was looking for any historical accounts of sleep paralysis that specifically mentioned the clicking sound. It wasn't something I'd ever come across in my research, but it was a potential link between Oliver and Brad's experiences. I knew the usual suspects would take up the challenge, eager listeners who'd helped me out on previous stories, Marissa in Alaska, Fern in Scotland, but it was a new listener named Adam who was the first to reach out with something, which was waiting for me in my inbox when I woke up in the hotel the following morning. Adam sent me a translated journal entry, originally written in German by a physician in the mid-18th century. Mostly, it described waking nocturnal paralysis in an unremarkable way. But the final 2 paragraphs revealed something interesting. They read as follows. The patient reports hearing a repeated clicking noise prior to visitation. I confess I do not know what to make of this. I have read Dr. Bond's recent work on the nightmare with interest, but his account does not speak of any such sound, nor of the sense, which the patient insists upon, that he is being watched by something with purpose from the corner of the room. The word stood out to me immediately. Visitation. Visitation by what? I moved on to the next item Adam had provided. It was again a journal entry written by a physician, this time around 50 years later, in 1801, in Warwickshire, England. The account was almost identical to that of the German physician, describing what was clearly sleep paralysis. But then it contained the following. The patient reports hearing a repeated clicking noise prior to visitation. I asked her 3 times to describe it more particularly, suspecting some ordinary cause, a clock or the settling of the house, but she was firm that it came from no fixed point. There were several more, separated by decades, different authors from different countries, but all containing variations of the exact same description. Clicking and visitation. I kept poring through them, finding nothing else of note, until I landed on one written in Boston at the end of the 19th century that contained an interesting additional detail that differentiated it from the rest. It read as follows. In all my time as a member of the Society of Beholders, this patient's account is one of the clearest indications I have yet recorded. He wakes, he says, with full possession of his senses, save that his body will not answer him. The paralysis is total. He cannot so much as part his lips to call out. He is adamant that in these episodes he is not alone, though he can see no one. He describes the sensation as being regarded, as a specimen might be regarded under glass. He reports hearing a repeated clicking noise prior to visitation. I have now collected 5 such accounts in the 11 years I have been a member of the Society, and each has ended in the same manner. I shall report this latest case back to my fellows. They will want to verify if the patient is indeed a receiver. Adam had left a note saying he couldn't find anything on who or what the Society of Beholders might be, but that he'd keep trying. So I focused on what was there, the 2 words that sang louder than any of the others. Visitation. Receiver. But who or what were they receiving a visit from? And what did the physician in Boston mean when they said that each of the 5 cases they'd encountered had ended in the same manner? Did it mean that these people they'd termed receivers had all gone on to kill, like Oliver Semyak had, and like I now feared Brad might be about to do too? The next day, Claire contacted me again and told me that Brad had got worse. She sounded panicked, desperate even. I drove from my hotel to their place. Brad opened the door when I knocked. He looked exhausted, blotchy dark circles around his eyes and movements jittery. We sat in the kitchen again, and Claire made coffee. I wondered how much of it Brad had already had. So what happened? I asked, interrupting an unpleasant silence that had stretched out between us. I went sleepwalking again last night, Brad said, but this time I remember all of it. What do you remember? I asked, intrigued. I had no control over my body, but I was completely lucid, he said. I just watched through my own eyes as my body got up out of bed and walked to that house again. He trailed off, but I could tell there was more. Only this time I went further than just standing outside it and staring, he said. I tried all the windows on the first floor until I found that one of the kitchen windows was unlocked. I climbed inside, took a knife from one of the drawers and... He went silent, and I felt goosebumps break out over every inch of my flesh. I didn't do anything to them, he clarified, putting me at somewhat more ease. I just watched them as they slept, looking down at them with a knife in my hand. Then I put it back where I'd found it, climbed back out the window, walked home, got into bed, and then snapped out of it and regained control of myself. It wasn't as bad as what I thought he might say, but not far off, and the unspeakable horror at the end of the process he was enduring, the one that had befallen Oliver Semyak, and had been cryptically hinted at in those physician journals, now seemed like an inevitable, oncoming truth. As I was wrestling with the weight of that, Claire suddenly interjected. "I took some sleeping pills. I just needed rest," she blurted out, as if confessing to a crime, like she was trying to explain why she hadn't stopped him. I nodded, understanding, and Brad assured her that none of this was in any way her fault. "Brad, when you were still in bed, before you got up, did you see something?" I asked. "The shadowy figure? The black smoke?" Brad shook his head. "I didn't see anything," he said. "I just heard that damn clicking." I took a chance to speak to Claire alone when Brad stepped out of the room. "You told me you didn't think he was dangerous," I said. She interrupted me. "I do now," she said solemnly, but then scrunched up her face, unhappy with her choice of words. "Well, not that he is dangerous, but that what's happening to him is." I nodded, and truth is, I did agree. Whatever it was, supernatural, psychological, it didn't matter. It was a threat. We soon came up with a plan and convinced Brad to go along with it, which didn't take much. He was clearly scared to death of what he might do. By nightfall, we'd fixed 3 deadbolt locks to the outside of the door to their spare bedroom, and set up a camera in the room with a live feed both Claire and I could access. Claire had tears streaming down her cheeks that evening when we slid the locks shut and sealed Brad inside for the night. Their fear had morphed into despair by that point, and you could cut the tension in the air with a knife. Claire asked me to stay over, and I could tell she really wanted me to accept the offer. That it'd make her feel safer, so I did. She grabbed me a pillow and some blankets, and I got set up on the couch while she hesitantly headed upstairs. It may sound strange, but I was so exhausted that it wasn't long before I fell into a dreamless sleep. The next time my eyes opened, I was confronted by pitch black, and I was invaded by a sense of disquieting dread. I had been yanked back into consciousness by a sound. Clicking, coming from the other side of the room. I was frozen, and in that moment, I didn't know if I was paralyzed with fear or by something else. I urged my body to cooperate with everything I had, and finally snapped out of it and snatched my phone from the coffee table right in front of me. I fumbled for the flashlight function, and the room lit up under its strange, digital glow, and I saw where the noise was coming from. It was just the air conditioner doing its thing. My heart slowed, but I was rattled. The situation was getting the better of me. Now very much awake, I checked the live feed of Brad, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The camera showed Brad was out of bed. He was standing facing the door. I could tell his eyes were open, and he was just staring out straight ahead at the closed door, a few inches from his face. His left hand was moving, and I could see he was trying the handle again and again, but not frantic, just a regular motion of trying to open the door, executed calmly over and over again, getting nowhere because of the deadbolts we'd installed. Our plan to keep him inside seemed to be working, but seeing the live feed of him like that, physically piloted by something other than his waking mind, disturbed me deeply, because I couldn't stop thinking about him being locked in, a prisoner, passively watching through his own eyes as his body just stood there and tried to open the door again and again. I forced myself to stop watching and tried my best to get back to sleep. Yeah, right. It wasn't my first time visiting someone incarcerated. It wasn't even my second or third time. My brother Cody had made sure of that. But going through the check-in process, and then the security protocols, I was still struck by the despairing sterility of the environment, and terrified of what a life within it must feel like. Something I'd only got a vicarious taste of through Cody, before he was released and ultimately disappeared out of my life. I was escorted, alongside others, into a visitation room scattered with tables and chairs bolted to the floor, and told where to sit. I didn't have to wait long before I saw the inmates being escorted in, from an entrance on the opposite side to where we'd entered, and I spotted Oliver Semyak. I watched him as he crossed the room and took a seat opposite me, and I was slightly taken aback by his appearance. When I'd corresponded with him 5 years prior, the images that had circulated of him in the media were of a slightly disheveled-looking man, hair on the thinner side, skin around the mouth beginning to sag into a slight jowl, despite only being in his 40s. But he looked better than when he'd been on the outside, fitter, like he'd been working out. And, most alarming of all, he seemed totally at peace with his surroundings. He sat across from me with the confident air of someone having a casual Sunday morning coffee with an old friend, not someone locked away in a hellhole and told they'd rot there until the day they died. You'd never have known this man had brutally murdered someone and claimed a shadow entity had turned into black smoke, possessed him, and forced him to do it. We had a short, stunted conversation where we asked each other how we were and mused on how it had been a long time since we'd corresponded, and I'd featured his story on the podcast. "I got a lot of letters after it went out," he said. I'd warned him that might happen. "I hope you didn't mind," I offered. He smiled. "Oh no," he said. Some of them turned out to be very worth reading. I nodded and switched to telling him about why I was there, wanting to make use of the time we had. I walked him through everything that had happened to Brad. He sat patiently listening while I did, not breaking eye contact with me once, and giving off the impression he was genuinely interested in what I had to say. "Has Brad made a sighting?" he asked when I'd finished. "Has he described seeing the figure I saw?" "No," I replied. Confusingly, a wide grin broke out across his face, like it was the answer he wanted. I went to speak again, but he got there first. "You know, I didn't think this was why you were coming to visit me," he said. I asked him what he meant. "I thought maybe they'd been in contact with you," he replied. "Who?" I asked. "Are you talking about the Society of Beholders?" He narrowed his eyes at me in a way which told me he genuinely hadn't heard that name before. He shook his head dismissively, and then leaned in closer. "There's a whole bunch of people who believe me, you know," he said, almost proudly. "I mean, like, really believe me. That thing that got inside me made me do what I did. They've been following it for centuries. Hell, maybe even forever." In that moment, I decided he probably was referring to the group I'd seen named in those journals. Only maybe they didn't call themselves the Society of Beholders all these years later. "They think I'm special," he added, with an earnestness that sounded like he thought so too. "Why?" I asked. "Because I'm the only person in all of history who's actually seen it," he replied. "And if I wasn't in here, they think he'd show himself to me again." His eyes glazed over a little, like he was losing himself to the memories of it. "These days, I call him the Clicker Man," he said. "But that is not what they call him." "What do they call him?" I asked. He didn't reply. Instead, he just smirked knowingly. The kind of smirk when someone wants to boast about knowing a secret they're not going to share with you. Then, he called out to the guard that the visit was over and that he wanted to go back to his cell, and was led away before I could do anything to convince him to stay. The next day, I was standing on a street corner, my view, and any view of me, obscured on either side by overgrown trees and shrubbery. It was no surprise that he'd asked me to meet him here. It had happened when I was being escorted out of the prison after my visit with Oliver came to an abrupt end. Unexpectedly, the guard had quietly asked me a question. Do you want to know about that group that come visit him?" "Why do you say they're a group?" I asked. A moment of silence rang out. I side-glanced at the guard. He seemed to be pondering whether or not to proceed. "Make it worth my while, and I'll tell you," he eventually said. It didn't take long before I found myself nodding and telling him yes, against my better judgment. "I can get your number from the visitor sheet you filled out," he said, voice even lower now. "I'll call you and set it up." That's how I'd ended up on the corner waiting for him, wad of bills tucked inside my pocket. He rounded the corner and stood close to me so he too would be protected by the insulating ring of foliage. I handed over the money in silence. "So, why did you call them a group?" I asked. "Anyone that visits him," he said, pocketing the money. "They all have the same tattoo on their right hand. Except for you, that is." I took my notepad out of my backpack, found the sketch I'd made of the wavy circle tattoo I'd seen on the guy's hand, who'd asked me, "Are you one of us?" outside the house Brad kept sleepwalking to. The guard nodded. "Yeah, that's it," he confirmed. "How do I find these people?" I asked. He laughed. "Don't worry, I'm giving you your money's worth," he said, and fished a crudely folded piece of paper out of his pocket. "Details of as many of them I could get my hands on at short notice, from the visitor forms," he confirmed, handing it over to me. "And I don't think I need to tell you to not ever mention where you got this from." The list contained 6 names and addresses, scrawled in handwriting that looked rushed, like he'd written it standing up, glancing over his shoulder. The first thing I did was search them online. It turned up nothing concrete. A couple of people who maybe were the ones I was looking for, but with common enough names that it could have been someone else. And there was no way of telling. No pictures I could find of them where their hand was showing, and I could check for the tattoo. But I was undeterred. I picked the 2 names with addresses the shortest distance away, and decided to drive out to them. The first address took me to a quiet residential street, 2 hours from the prison. Except there was no house at the address, just a lot, overgrown, and a rusted chain-link fence sagging around its perimeter. I sat in my car for a while, checking and rechecking the address against the scrap of paper and my GPS. I knocked on the house next door to the lot. An older man answered, squinting at me like he was already suspicious I might be there to try and sell him something. "Used to be a family there," he said when I inquired about the vacant lot. "They sold up a long time ago now. The new owner tore the place down and was going to build something new, but I don't know what happened." "Do you remember their name, or have a way to contact them?" I asked. He didn't, or at least he said he didn't, in the way people do when they've decided a question isn't worth their time. I tried a couple more of the neighbors, but nobody knew anything. The second address didn't exist at all, not in the way I expected at least. It was a P.O. box at a store 3 towns over. I stood in front of the wall of little brass doors for a few minutes, like I might be able to see through one of them if I looked hard enough. The person behind the counter told me, without me even asking, that they couldn't give out box holder information. I tried the third address, a renovated townhouse in a wealthy neighborhood that otherwise consisted of monolithic condos. A young woman who might have only been around 20 or so opened the door and said she'd never heard of the person I'd been told lived there. I took the opportunity to ask her if she'd recognize any of the other names on my list, but she shook her head, inching the door closed as I rattled through them, looking at me like I might be crazy. She didn't even let me finish apologizing for taking up her time, slamming it shut while I was mid-sentence. I considered my options. If this pattern was anything to go by, all 6 of the addresses would be dead ends. So I decided to send the list to Adam, having concluded he must be the real deal after he'd turned up those historical physician entries. I didn't tell him where the list had come from, or why I had it, or really much of anything else. I just asked if he could see if any of the names connected to anything, or if there was anything to link them together. I got an email around an hour later when I was getting gas, but it wasn't from Adam. It was from an account that was just a garbled sequence of letters and numbers. The body of the email contained just 3 words. Brad last night. There was a video attachment with it. Unable to resist, I clicked it. It was shaky camera footage in that insipid light green of grainy night vision, like it had been shot on one of those old handheld digital cameras. The camera was recording footage of a door. The door to the room Claire and I had locked Brad inside. I recognized it instantly when I saw the 3 deadbolts we'd fitted. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. I knew in my gut that this video had not come from Claire. I watched as the person recording outstretched their hand, revealing that same tattoo of the wavy circle, and undid the first bolt, then the second. The moment they slid the third one open, the door almost flew off its hinges. Struggling to follow the flurry of movement, the recording just about caught sight of Brad storming out of the room, running past the camera. The person recording took out after him, following him down the stairs, through the house, and out onto the street as he burst through the front door. Now out in the night, they stopped and just recorded Brad as he sped down the street with lunatic force, seeming to move as quickly and purposefully as his body would allow, his bare feet pounding the concrete with disturbingly impactful thuds. But worst of all, I knew where he was going. And then, the video ended. I immediately tried to call Claire, but her phone was switched off, so I decided I needed to get back there. How had the intruder got inside? What had they done with Claire? And what had Brad done to the people in that house that he kept sleepwalking to? The one I knew he was running toward. And was it the same as what Oliver Semyak had done to his victim? When I finally got there, the place was swarming with cops. They'd set up do not cross tape around Brad and Claire's place, and the house Brad kept sleepwalking to. I'd already got the answer to my most important question. The worst possible conclusion had happened, but I was too terrified to make myself known to the cops of what had happened to me if I told them we knew Brad might kill the people that lived in that house. So I turned around and fled back to my hotel. I got an email from Adam later while I was holed up in my hotel room, just laying on the bed and trying my hardest to fight back against the feeling that I was coming undone. Most of the names turned up nothing, the email said, but 2 of them showed up together in an old newsletter, late 90s, some kind of trust doing fundraising for a community project, the Lidio Foundation. Doesn't look like it filed anything past 2003, but I found the foundation's last known address. He'd included a scan of the newsletter, which had been faded by time, and only what Adam had already distilled was legible. I tossed my phone aside. Adam had already flagged how thin it was. A defunct foundation, a scanned, faded newsletter. 2 names on the list joined together in a way that could just as easily be coincidence. But the longer I lay there, feeling like I was sinking, as the awful reality of what had happened took hold and refused to dissipate, I found myself itching for more answers. I still didn't feel like I could face the clusterfuck that going to the cops would cause, so I found myself hauling my ass off the bed and grabbing my keys. The address Adam had found for the trust took me 3 hours away, to a tiny town that seemed to consist mainly of empty space and grass that looked like it needed more love. Specifically, the address landed me at a small, timber-framed white church. I parked across the street and watched it for a while. No one went in or out. I decided to head inside anyway, and found myself alone in there. Single aisle, rows of pews on each side, so typical it might as well have been a kid's drawing of the interior of a church. As I was about to leave, I heard a door open beside the altar, and a priest emerged. He spotted me and walked over slowly. He was wearing his white collar and a short-sleeved black shirt, and I could see that there was no tattoo on his hand. "Can I help you?" he asked, a kind smile on his face. I asked him if he knew anything about the Lidio Foundation. "I'm sorry, but I've never heard of it," he said, like he was disappointed he couldn't assist. Staring at that kind-faced priest, I started to run back through what had led me there. A guard who'd taken my money and handed me a piece of paper with no guarantee of any of it meaning anything. A listener I'd never corresponded with before, who'd given me baseless information about a defunct charity 2 decades dead, and I realized I was chasing ghosts. I thanked the priest anyway, accepting it was just another dead end in the maddening mystery of it all. "Are you sure there isn't something I can help you with?" he asked again. I told him that I didn't think he could. that I was looking for something, but that I'd clearly been misled. I was about to turn and leave when he spoke again. You may not realize it, but yours is a sinful crusade, Billy. I froze. I had not told him my name. His face had completely changed. The kind openness was gone, replaced by a stern, yet purposeful scowl. I went to speak, but I couldn't get the words out. Just ask me what you want to ask me, he said coldly. I took a deep breath, tried to steady myself. Out of everything I wanted to know, one question rose to the surface. What is it? I asked. Our theories have evolved and changed over centuries, he replied, focused intently on me. But one thing we are sure of. It is God. His words frightened me because of the conviction behind them. But I found myself unable to turn and leave, unable to end this without understanding what the hell was happening. It chooses a receiver who kills, to alter the course of history to God's will, he added, still watching me like a hawk. Why it chooses to kill who it does, we do not know, for we cannot understand the enormity and nuance of God's plan. I took a step backward, deeply unsettled by his unwavering glare, but hypnotized by the fact I was finally interfacing with someone behind the curtain of what I'd stumbled across, and now so desperately wanted to comprehend. But we do know that the course of history is irrevocably changed by one death that wouldn't have happened otherwise, he continued. And then he took a single step forward toward me. By trying to stop Brad from his purpose, you defied God, he said, voice edging into a rasp. Did you see Brad on the camera, running to kill that family? That is because God needed it to happen before a certain time, to generate the outcome it clearly wanted, and time was almost up. I stared back at him. His eyes had widened, his jaw had clenched, his chest now heaving up and down. He was getting worked up, and I suddenly didn't want to hear any more. Didn't want to stick around to see if his vitriol would morph into rage. But before I could flee, I heard the door to the church shut, and turned to see that a group of around 6 people had entered. I tried to run, to move in any direction that would take me away from them, instinctively knowing they had come from me. But they were on me too fast. They grabbed me and pinned me down against the floor as I screamed, and I saw each and every one of them had that same tattoo on their right hand. I struggled with everything I had, but there was nothing I could do, overpowered and outnumbered. With them holding me down on the ground, the priest stepped back into view, coming close to loom over me, and I saw that he had removed his shirt, and on his torso was a giant tattoo of the wavy circle. You do not simply get to defy God, he snarled, spittle flying from his mouth. I saw that he was holding something. It looked like a glass jar full of black smoke. He opened it and lifted it to his lips, and huffed in a huge lungful of whatever it was, keeping his mouth shut so it wouldn't escape. And then he got on his hands and knees and crawled over so he was looking directly down at my face. One of the people holding me down grabbed my head and forced my mouth wide open. I thrashed, trying to free myself, but it was no use. I tried not to breathe, but it quickly got to the point where I had no choice. I had to gasp for air. And when I did, the priest bent forward and exhaled that black smoke right into my lungs. I didn't feel anything, apart from utter fear. But when I breathed out, no black smoke billowed from my mouth, like it had somehow stayed inside me. We have marked you as a candidate to be a receiver, the priest said, rising to his feet. If you do not leave us alone, we will see to it that God pays you a visit. Do you understand? Yes, I screamed. I understand. Well, there you have it. That's my story. Ironically, I'm going to ask you now what Oliver Semyak asked me 5 years ago when we first wrote to one another. Do you believe me? I also wrestle with what to believe. I live in fear of the threat that was made against me in that church, with no way of knowing if it was a genuine ritual that has left me open to possession by what those people call God, that thing which Oliver called the Clicker Man, or if it was all just smoke and mirrors, a trick designed to get me to back off. Either way, it worked. Brad is in custody, awaiting trial. Claire is alive, I know that much, but I didn't pick up whenever she tried to call, so she stopped trying. Recording this is as far as I'm willing to go. Maybe a compromise. One I might be able to live with. I'm not sure. Anyway, I've laid everything out exactly the way it happened. The choice of whether or not to believe me is yours. But before I go, and leave you to wrestle with your own opinion on the things I've said, I'm going to play you something.
Authorities have confirmed that convicted murderer Oliver Semyak staged a successful prison break last night. Semyak was serving a life sentence for first-degree murder. The police have launched a full-scale manhunt, and authorities say that Semyak could not have orchestrated or executed the escape on his own, and are asking for anyone with any information to please come forward. Oliver Semyak is considered to be extremely dangerous.